Okay. Oh, fun. That's good. Yeah. Yeah. Hey, Michelle, y'all. How are y'all tonight? You're together. Yes, sir. Good. Brad.
going to start. That's the difference between my clock and your clock. So, Brian's going to lead us in prayer real quick, and then we're going to get started.
Let's pray together. Lord God, thank you so much for the day. Thank you for the opportunity to live another day, and I pray that we have all lived that day in a way that pleases you, that we have shared your light to others. God, we thank you for an opportunity that we can come together and we can spend some time studying your word. We can spend some time trying to understand the incredible creation that you have given us. And I pray, God, that it helps us to deepen our faith to you, help us to understand you better. God, we have a number of people who are ill, those who have lost loved ones. You know each of our hearts, you know what is on our minds. And I pray, God, that you will oversee all of those thoughts, and that you will bring healing, and that you will bring comfort where it is needed. Thank you for your love. May we continue to strive to be your children in your name. Amen.
We've been talking about Noah's flood. Did it happen? Was it a real event? Was it global? And we kind of finished up with that, and we were going to look at some evidences that help support a worldwide flood event. But before I get into all of that, I was asked a question at the end of last Wednesday. 3 people asked me the same question. And that's that if it was a worldwide flood event, where did all the water go afterwards? So I decided, I didn't know how much I wanted to talk about that because it might be kind of complicated, but I decided we're going to go ahead and take a stab at it and talk about that. And I apologize if it gets real technical. I'm going to try not to make it super technical, but we may get into some technical stuff. But as I was reading through some of the stuff I was looking over this week, I came upon a quote, and it was actually in a creationist article, and it was talking about that as Christians, we need to be careful of the extremes that oftentimes we'll say, oh, well, that scientific theory was proposed by an evolutionist. I don't believe in evolution, it's wrong. Just because an evolutionist proposed a scientific theory does not make it wrong. And at the same time, just because a creationist scientist proposes a theory does not make it right. All we're doing is looking at evidence. And also, one thing we need to be careful about is that just because the scientific community, if the majority of them agrees upon something, that doesn't make it true. We've got to look at evidence, and there are some things, everything we've been talking about is theory, because none of us were there, none of us saw it. We're looking at evidence based on assumptions, based on observations and research, and there are some things, like we talked about with the story of Flatland, there are some things that we are not going to understand. And no amount of research is ever going to make us understand it. There are certain supernatural events. Oftentimes, a lot of people want to say, I don't care how God created the world. All I know is God created the world, and that's enough for me. And, that's fine if you have that faith. But there are some supernatural events that we are never going to understand. When in Exodus 17, as long as Moses holds up his hands, the Israelites beat the Amalekites. You are never going to find a natural explanation for why that worked. God did that. In Joshua chapter 10, Joshua prays that the sun would hold still so that the Israelites could beat their enemies. And in verse 13, it says that the sun stopped for about a day. You are not going to find a natural explanation for how the sun could have possibly stopped for a day. When Jesus was crucified, you are not going to find a natural explanation for why in the middle of the day the earth darkened for 3 hours. A lot of people want to say an eclipse. Eclipses do not last 3 hours. They last a few minutes, and they're not as widespread as some of the reports of that time indicate that darkness was. You know, all through the gospel, we have evidence of, or the Bible telling us that God raised people from the dead. Jesus was raised from the dead. Jairus' daughter, Tabitha, the widow's son, Lazarus. You are not going to find a natural explanation for how that happened. And all the miraculous healings that at the time they did not have the science and medications to heal, yet people were healed instantly. And you're not going to find natural explanations for a lot of that. So even a lot of the stuff I'm telling you, I'm not saying that that's how it happened. I'm saying these are theories that have been proposed, and just like all the other theories, there's evidence to support them as well as there's evidence to support some of the other stuff. But all of these theories also have problems. And further research may help to, clarify those problems, and it may not ever help clarify those problems. So we're going to look at a couple of theories that have been proposed about how the flood actually naturally could have occurred, and at the same time where the water could have gone afterwards. And so we're going to have a really quick lesson on plate tectonics. Everybody know what plate tectonics are? Okay, so we are on solid ground right now, right? It's solid. But the ground we're on, think of it like a giant land raft floating on top of a lake of magma or lava. And, you have the crust, which is the actual ground that we're standing on. Underneath that, you have something called the lithosphere, which is kind of like the base rock that is what happens when the magma cools. And then underneath that, you have something called the asthenosphere. And all of that makes up something called the mantle. So, I don't care if you know about lithosphere and asthenosphere, but later we're going to talk about the mantle. And, we live on the crust. So, we have more than a dozen of these giant land rafts. And we call them, each one of these is called a tectonic plate. And like anything that is floating on top of something, they move. We have continental plates where all the dry land is. You see here the North American plate, where North America, the South American plate, and then you have some plates like the Pacific plate that are completely underwater. And those are oceanic plates. Continental plates are made out of a different kind of rock than oceanic plates. So whenever, now a quick lesson on geology. There's 3 types of rock. You have igneous rock, which is when lava cools, it forms hardened rock called igneous rock. You have sedimentary rock. These are things that we're familiar with around here, like sandstone, limestone. And you have sediments that settle that get compressed and cemented together over time, forming sedimentary rock. And then you can have something called metamorphic rock, that when you take some of these rocks and apply heat to them, they will kind of plasticize and recrystallize into a new type of rock. So, all of these plates are made out of 2 different types of igneous rock. The oceanic plates that are ocean floor are made out of basalt. Basalt is predominantly lots of iron, lots of magnesium, and a little bit of silicone. The continental plates are made out of granite. Granite is mostly silicone with a little bit of iron and magnesium. Granite is less dense than basalt. So the ocean plates floating on top of that magma, the basalt is much heavier, the ocean plates, so they tend to sink lower into the magma. So we have the ocean floor. The granite continental plates tend to float higher, which pushes the land up above the water, so we have dry land. Everybody with me so far? You bet. Okay. So, because they are made out of different rock They float differently, they move differently, they act differently. And based on how they move determines if we get volcanoes or deep ocean trenches or mountain ranges and earthquakes. So here, look where the North American plate meets the Pacific plate. Where is that happening? And what does California have? Lots of earthquakes, because you see the red arrows are telling you the direction. These two plates are sliding against each other, and sometimes they hang up, and then suddenly they'll release, and you get a big earthquake. You can get earthquakes too when you get an ocean fault that pushes down underneath. Sometimes they'll hang up, and then we get offshore earthquakes that create tsunamis. You can also, when you get two continental plates that push together, they crumple up and can form mountain ranges. So, depending on how these plates move and interact together and what they're made out of, whether basalt or granite, determines what's happening with them. Now, we know these plates move because we can measure them with satellite imagery. And on average, they move about 2 centimeters a year. So a little bit less than 1 inch per year. Now, the idea that these continents move was first proposed by a French creation geologist in 1859. And his name was Antonio Snider Pellegrini. Sounds more Italian, but it said he was a French geologist. He had read Genesis 1, verses 9 and 10. And it says, "And God said, let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear. And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and the gathered waters he called seas, and God saw that it was good." After reading this, where he noticed it said, "Let the waters be gathered together in one place," he got to looking at how the shorelines of South America and Africa and North America kind of look like puzzle pieces that fit together. So he theorized that if all the water was gathered to one place and dry land appeared, he theorized that we had a supercontinent and there was only one big giant continent at the time of creation. He also theorized that during Noah's flood, we had catastrophic plate tectonics that tore this supercontinent apart and contributed to the flood occurring. So, you've probably heard of this supercontinent as called Pangaea. Okay, Pangaea is basically, they call it a supercontinent. Secular geologists agree that Pangaea probably existed at one time. And most creationists, geologists, also agree that Pangaea probably existed at one time. Now, again, it's theory, it's assumption. We have no proof of this. We only can look at evidence that might support it. So, Antonio published his book on the topic in 1859. Unfortunately, he published it in French, and not a lot of people were reading French at the time. But more importantly, he published it at the same time that Darwin published his book, Origin of the Species. And everyone was reveling at Darwin's publication, and Pellegrini's book was just kind of forgotten about. Nobody really saw it. Nobody really thought anything of it. Then in 1912, a German meteorologist named Alfred Wegener, he published a book that basically reproposed the same ideas that continents moved apart. And we had Pangaea, he proposed that they moved apart, but instead of being moved by Noah's catastrophic flood, he proposed that it happened slowly over periods of millions of years. That became known as continental drift theory. So, old Earth geologists will tell us that the Pangaea supercontinent existed around 300 million years ago. Because if the continents are moving at an average rate of about 2 centimeters you back calculate and you figure out that based on lateral and horizontal movements, that they would have fit together about 300 million years ago. So for 50 years, his continental drift theory was ridiculed by leading geologists who said his ideas were preposterous, that they were ridiculous, the Earth's crust is too strong to allow continents to move, and that his theory, they called it pseudoscientific fantasy that violated basic principles of physics. For 50 years, until some research was done in 1965 and 1967 that proved that the continents do actually move. So it's not been that long ago that it has been accepted by geologists that the continental plates actually move. 60 years. So, but plate tectonics explains a lot of things that geologists were struggling to figure out. You know, they knew that we had earthquakes in specific locations. I mean, when was the last time we had a massive earthquake here in the Panhandle? We're not near a fault line. But they knew that certain areas had repetitive earthquakes, and when they figured out these plate tectonic boundaries, they realized that a lot of these earthquakes were occurring on these plate boundaries. So plate tectonics helped explain why certain areas get a lot of earthquakes and some areas don't. It also helped explain how deep ocean trenches are formed, because nobody really knew how they were formed. But when an ocean plate pushes underneath, it causes an offshore deep ocean trench to form. And it helped explain how certain mountain ranges on one continent matched up geologically, the same sedimentary rock, the same fossils within the sediments, and the same deformation formations in the mountains themselves, even though they're on separate continents. And I'm going to look at an example of that in a minute. So, but there are still problems with the whole plate tectonics thing. There are still unknown mysteries, things we don't understand, things that slow 2-centimeter movements over millions of years can't explain. One of them is magnetic polarities on the ocean floor, which I'm going to explain a little bit more later. And one of them is how the ocean floor plates are much, much younger than the continental plates. So if they're younger, it's because they had to have been formed recently, or more recently than the continental plates. And it also explains one of the other mysteries is why, where these ocean trenches are formed, we don't have millions of years of sediment compression, because we should, and we don't have it. But some of these things can be explained by rapid tectonic plate movement. And there's a creation theory that we're going to look at in a minute that says these plates did move, but it didn't happen 2 centimeters a year. It happened really, really fast. So that's where we get the development of a model called catastrophic plate tectonic model. And that was developed in 1986 by Dr. John Baumgartner. He's an interesting guy. He graduated from Texas Tech with a degree in electrical engineering. Then he went and got a master's degree from Princeton in electrical engineering. And he was working on his PhD in electrical engineering when he was converted to Christianity. He grew up in an atheist home. He was an atheist. When he was working on his PhD degree, he became a Christian. Well, he realized that he wanted to be able to use his scientific knowledge and background to help support biblical principles. So he actually quit his electrical engineering PhD degree, never finished it. He took a job in the Air Force working in the weapons laboratory for 4 years. Then he went to Berkeley and earned a master's in physics and space physics. And let's see, let me make sure what his master's was in. planetary, no, that's not it. I wrote it down somewhere. Geophysics and space physics. And then once he completed his master's, he earned a PhD in geophysics and space physics. He was then hired to work in the theoretical division at the Los Alamos National Laboratory doing research in planetary mantle dynamics. So the mantle, remember, that's the crust, the lithosphere, and the asthenosphere. That's the upper layers of the Earth, the mantle. He was doing research in planetary mantle dynamics, and some of the research he was doing included catastrophic mantle overturn. So we have catastrophic plate tectonics. He theorized that we did have a supercontinent, but it wasn't Pangaea, it was called Rodinia. The difference is these continental plates are in a different order for Rodinia. He ended up developing a supercomputer model, and that model, even though it is a creationist model, is accepted as one of the best computer models out there for explaining plate tectonics. And what his catastrophic plate tectonic model said is that this Rodinia continent, supercontinent, broke apart during the flood. When the Bible says the great springs of the deep burst forth, he's theorizing that these continental plates broke apart at that time. And the ocean floors broke, the continents spread rapidly. And there is evidence to support rapid plate movement, and I'll talk about it in a little bit. But as the plates spread rapidly, we had a lot of magma coming up into the ocean, which would have created a whole lot of steam, which would have blown a whole lot of moisture into the atmosphere, which would have precipitated and condensed and precipitated and come back down as massive amounts of rain. Also, as this magma is flowing out, it's cooling rapidly, forming new ocean floor, but the new ocean floor is much warmer than the old ocean floor. The colder things get, the more dense they become, the more dense, the more they sink. So these warm ocean floors, in his model, it showed that by having these warm ocean floors, the ocean floors may have actually lifted a mile, which would have brought the sea level up a mile. And that would have pushed all of that water inland, and there would have been earthquakes and huge tidal waves, and we've seen how destructive tidal waves around the world can be when they're only 3 or 4 feet tall. So imagine massive tidal waves. Now, he's also theorized that when those ocean plates would hit a continental plate, that's called subduction, that think of a weight when it hits in the water like a fishing weight and you push the button, it just starts dropping really fast. That when that ocean plate begins to subduct, he theorized that it would take off on a runaway event, and instead of moving 2 centimeters per year, it would actually take off and move several meters per second. And some recent research in Alaska in some ocean trenches is actually showing in areas of subduction you are getting rapid plate movement of several meters per second instead of 2 centimeters per year. So there is recent research, I think it was 2021 is when they actually found this, that supports rapid plate movement. This catastrophic plate tectonic model suggests that after the initial Rodinia supercontinent broke up, everything's underwater, the water is covering everything to a depth of 30 meters or 30 cubits, that while it was underwater, these plates moved back together rapidly, forming Pangaea, underwater. And the reason that he says this is because most geologists will agree that many of the mountain ranges around the Earth, the Himalayas, Rockies, things like that, were formed with sedimentary layers. So if a lot of the sedimentary layers came from Noah's flood, then they had to have not been formed yet, and then all those sedimentary layers are formed in these mountain ranges. So that's why he says that we had a supercontinent that broke apart and then came crashing back together, creating a lot of these mountain ranges that have the sedimentary debris in the buildup of the mountain ranges. And then after that, the plates began to move back to where they currently are today. So we have what's called the Appalachian Mountains in North America. And this is where basically Pangea would have fit together. The Appalachian Mountains are very similar to the Caledonian Mountains in Northern Europe. They have the same sediment layers, they have the same deformations in mountain formation, they have this similar fossilized remains within the sediment layers, yet currently these are thousands of miles apart. But the fact that they have similar layers, similar formations, similar fossils indicates that at some point in the past, they were probably together. And since the Appalachians and the Caledonian Mountains were formed with flood sedimentation, or with sedimentation layers, he theorizes that while the world was flooded, these mountain ranges were formed, and then they spread to their current location. So his 3D model that suggests this does a lot, it explains a lot of things that slow 2 centimeter per year movement can't explain. Now again, I'm not saying that this is how it happened. I'm saying there is evidence to support that it could have happened this way. Now, one of the things we know is that as the ocean floor moves apart, it's because we have magma coming up. And what happens to lava when it hits cold water? It cools and hardens, right? Now, that ocean floor is mainly made of basalt. Basalt has a lot of iron in it. So, here we have the earth. What do we have up here? What do we have down here? Okay, now we have a magnet. What do we have on one end of the magnet? We have a North Pole. What do we have on the other end? A South Pole. So we have magnets that, and the Earth has a magnetic field. As this lava is forming out, we actually have on the ocean floor what are called magnetic, or call them like magnetic zebra stripes. And we have these alternating stripes that basically we show one stripe has north and south, the next stripe has south and north, indicating that these poles reverse. Now, long-term geology science, long Earth science says that this happens naturally about every 750 to 1,000 to a million years. So you would expect, if this took 1 million years, you would expect to see this. And we do see this. However, when you take boreholes through these, you find one layer that's north and south, the next layer is switched, the next layer, we find rapid switching in the layers as you bore down through those holes, which means this happened really fast. Not every 750,000 to a million years, but it happened really fast. So one of the things that determines magnetic field has to do with the spinning of the core, the heat, and if we're losing a whole lot of heat into the ocean, it could have slowed down and sped up, causing these rapid reversals. And one of the models they have looked at, if you look at the magnetic polarities over time, you actually show, everything's winding down. That's the law of entropy that we've talked about. Everything is winding down. But you actually show that over time, you had this nice stable magnetic field, and then around the time of the flood, we had these real rapid fluctuations that then slowed down and leveled back out. And we see a lot of these magnetic flippings that are occurring. So, and one of the scientists who looked at this, his name was Russell Humphreys, he's a physicist, and he actually proposed that you would have these alternating layers when you bored, and then they bored and found them. And he is a creation physicist, and he found these alternating magnetic poles, and he had said that if this is true, if we had this rapid catastrophic event and the ocean floor broke open and all these things, he goes, as you bore through, you're going to find these alternating layers, and that's what they found. So again, I'm not saying that's how it was. I'm just saying that's evidence that helps to support it. And like I said from the very beginning, none of us were there. None of us saw it happen. Even Noah on the ark wasn't seeing what was happening under the water. So everything that we are looking at is completely based on theory, assumptions, observances. And one of the problems that we can sometimes get into is that the plates are moving 2 centimeters a year now, but were they 1,000 years ago? Were they 5,000 years ago? Just because it's happening that way today does not mean that that's how it has always been. Maybe it has. Maybe it hasn't.
That kind of impresses me that in my lifetime, tectonic plates have moved 6.5 feet.
Yeah.
A lot of movement going on.
Yeah. When you're talking thousands of miles, you don't notice 6.5 feet. Now, one of the things also is that if the plates have always been moving 2 centimeters a year, they're saying that they're not moving fast enough that when these plates collided, that they would have reduced the Himalayan mountains to the height that they're at. Because they're saying at 2 centimeters a year, imagine 2 cars driving towards each other, each one going 0.4 of a mile an hour. They're going to bump, and they might do a little bit of damage, but it's not going to crumple that bad. But with catastrophic movement, imagine 2 cars going 62 miles an hour headed straight towards each other and ramming head on. So in order to get the Himalayan mountains to the height that they are, we need faster plate tectonics than we currently have today. So there is evidence that supports catastrophic plate tectonic theory. There is evidence that supports long, slow movement. So you just kind of have to look at the evidence and decide which one you're going to follow. And there's problems with all of these theories. There's problems with slow movement, like the height of the Himalayas. There's problems with fast movement. I don't want to get too deep into it, but rapid plate tectonics releases a lot of heat. That heat has to go somewhere. And they claim that, mainstream scientists will tell you that there's too much heat generated by the plates moving that fast. So there's problems associated with everything, and maybe some of those problems are like the supernatural events I talked about earlier. That's just what God took care of. I don't know how he did it. We may never learn how he did it. It may have been a supernatural event. We believe in a God that raised the dead as a supernatural event. Why do we have to make a natural event? Because that's what mainstream science tells us it has to be. It doesn't necessarily mean it has to be that way. Now, I think these are some pretty interesting theories, but what does the Bible say about it? If you want to turn to Psalm 104, okay, so this is the NIV. Does anyone here have American Standard or New American Standard? Okay, don't read it yet, but you're going to notice a difference. Okay, so starting in verse 5, it says, He, meaning God, He set the earth on its foundation, it can never be moved. Verse 6, you covered it with the watery depths as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. It sounds to me like he's talking about the flood. Okay? At your rebuke, the waters fled. At the sound of your thunder, they took to flight. They flowed over the mountains. They went down into the valleys to the place you assigned them. You set a boundary they cannot cross. Never again will they cover the earth. When I read this, it says to me, it sounds like the flood, but it sounds in verse 8, the waters flowed over the mountains, the waters went down into the valley. Now, what does the New American Standard say about verse 8?
Mountains rose, the valleys sank down.
So, NIV says they, and to me that it says they're talking about the waters. The waters flowed over the mountains, the waters went down into the valley. But the New American Standard says the mountains rose, the valleys sank. Which one is correct? And these, there are several versions that say they flowed over and they sank. There are several versions that say the mountains rose and the valleys sank. And to me, that makes a difference as to where the water went. Because NIV sounds like a supernatural event. God commanded the waters and they went where he told them to. New American Standard sounds, maybe some supernatural involved, but also sounds more like a naturalistic event. Water's covering the earth, and suddenly you have mountains rise up and valleys sink, giving dry land and a place for water to go.
Well, the NIV is more accurate than the American Standard anyways.
Well, I wanted to know what the truth was, so I consulted the Oracle, and I went to Google, and I wanted to look at some original translations. What did the original Hebrew say? I don't speak Hebrew, so it's still difficult to understand. Hebrew does not use descriptors. The original Hebrew says mountain, or says rise mountain, sink valley. That doesn't really help a whole lot in my opinion. So I ended up finding a paper that was written in 1998 by Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor has degrees in language, music, and theology. He has a master's in linguistics and a PhD in Central African languages. And he works as a fellow for the Institute of Linguistics, or at least he did. So he's someone who knows languages. He understands languages. He read the NIV. And he said, but, and I kind of remembered this too. It's like, I kind of remember a verse talking about the mountains rising, the valleys sinking. So this will test your Bible knowledge. But he said, like a good Berean, so you'll have to figure out what that means. He went and looked at multiple translations. And he came to the conclusions, looking at the original, looking at the Greek. Greek has special endings that tell you what the verb and noun and different and adjective and stuff is. And based on his study of it, he determined that the original psalmist is saying the mountains actually did rise and the valleys actually did sink. And this, to me, easily describes a catastrophic plate tectonic event where the water is covered with earth, maybe halfway through the flood, the waters are beginning to recede, and suddenly you have these continental plates slamming back together, creating the Appalachian Caledonian mountain range and the Himalayas and other mountain ranges. And once they do that, they pull apart, creating new ocean trenches that are super deep and allowing for a whole lot of this water that's covering the earth a place to go. It fits with the catastrophic plate theory.
John,
Yes,
do you think there were mountains before the flood?
I think there were mountains before the flood. I just think they were different.
Well, in verse 6, it said the water stood above the mountain.
Right. And we know from the flood event, it told us that the waters covered the mountains to a depth of 30 cubits. So you know, to me, that's some Bible support to a catastrophic. I'm not saying catastrophic plate tectonic theory is correct, but that is some Bible support for some sort of catastrophic event that formed new mountain ranges and new valleys, that gave the water that was covering the earth a place to go, and produced new dry land, uplifting some of the continents to get dry land where it was.
You know, John, this is just what came into my head. You know, you used car theory a while ago.
Yeah.
Two cars hit each other on 65 miles an hour head on. A lot of times those cars bounce.
Yep.
And they come back apart. If land could move at that sort of speed, if that were possible, it's possible then that they balanced, which could create what you have in the Caledonian and the Appalachian
Right.
Mountains as well.
You know,
And
and
that could also maybe speak to the valley sinking as well. Potentially.
you know, and I'm not saying take all of this that I'm saying this is what it is. I'm just saying that all the evidence that we are taught in school that it's fact, it's this way, it happened that way, it's fact, we proved it. It wasn't proven. It is theory. Some of it is based on assumption. Over time, some of those assumptions have been proven wrong. So new theories have been developed to answer that. There are problems with these theories. Over time, they may find some evidence that explains it. But I'm offering it as it is an alternative possible evidence that helps to support that, you know, the flood was a global event, not a regional event. Yeah.
Were the springs breaking forth at the beginning of the flood?
Yeah.
Was that an actual event or was that a record?
I mean, we know springs burst and stuff, but what caused it? You know, I mean, yeah, God had to have caused it. You know, I don't think God set the world in motion and said, all right, see you at the resurrection. You know, I think he's been involved in guiding, and sometimes, you know, he destroyed the world. He didn't set the world in motion saying, in 1,600 years, people are going to be corrupt and I'm going to wipe them out with a flood, so I'm just going to sit back and let it happen. People were wicked. He destroyed the world. You know, so I do think that at times in the past, he has triggered specific events to happen.
Was there not any rain until the flood?
We're going to talk about that.
Talking about Hebrew is that one version is making the mountains an object, whereas the other one is making it a subject.
Mhm.
Now the question is what's the closest reference?
The Greek.
To the, now, in Hebrew, it's more common for the subject to follow the noun rather than to be before, the subject to follow the verb rather than being before the verb. And then we also don't have any conjunctions either. Now,
Right.
that's one point, Elvis. Number 2 point is if you look at the entire 104th Psalm, it outlines into the first six days of creation. And when we go in the third day, you have the water gathered to one place. That implies that
Mhm. And dry land and dry ground appeared.
and so you have another issue too, is that I think God used the flood too to create a new heavens and a new earth, to recreate the original creation.
Yeah, and we're going to talk a little bit about the new earth after the flood.
And then, so I think it's easier to look at these, the mountains and the valley plains, they're both plural, as subjects, because there's no water. Mine is Hebrew word for water. It's not. I don't even see the word here. So there has to be some kind of plural as a subject here.
Right.
Closest plural verb or nouns
Yeah.
And it says this place, it doesn't say a place, it says this place that you have formed or set up or allocated, whatever.
So, a couple other things I want to look at. This is called monument fold. And if you can't see it, we know that the sedimentary layers stack on top of each other. Here we have the sedimentary layers bending and moving, and this is in the Grand Canyon. So there are a number of areas like this in the Grand Canyon, various different folds. And you can see that these sedimentary layers have been bent. How do you bend rock? I'm not saying you can't. Okay, so I did a little experiment. So here we have some sedimentary layers that used to be clay, and they've dried out and now they're rock. If I try to bend them, they're brittle, they break, they don't bend. However, if I have some layers that are still wet, they bend pretty easily. And I'm not saying that you can't bend rock, because you actually can. It is possible to bend rock. So typically sedimentary layers lay down flat. If you have floodwaters and dust and all that, it settles flat. Everything likes to be flat. Earth likes to be flat. That's balanced. So something after these layers were set down caused them to bend. Now, creation science will say that some sort of cataclysmic force after the flood, when the waters were receding, would have caused these layers to bend while they were wet. Wet because of the global flood. Old Earth geology will say that millions of years of pressure and heat along with plate tectonics would have caused these layers to bend after they had hardened into sedimentary rock. Both of these ideas are plausible. Rock exposed to heat and pressure, low-level heat, it doesn't have to be high heat. Low-level heat and pressure can kind of plasticize that rock and make it to where you can bend it. Now, when these limestone layers are exposed to heat and you bend them, the rock should recrystallize. That's where we have metamorphic rock. In order to get the heat enough to be able to bend it, that would cause the limestone to recrystallize and form a metamorphic rock called quartzite. When they take samples from these folds, they find no evidence of quartzite, which means they had to have probably been bent while they were wet, not after they were dry. And if they were bent while they were wet, these layers really can't have been exposed to millions of years of heat and pressure, or we should see quartzite, and we don't see quartzite in these layers. Now, there's an experiment you can do where you can take a scoop of dirt, put it in a jar. We know that floods are very catastrophic. So you can pour water in this jar and shake it. That's your catastrophic flood. And then you set that jar aside, and you will see different sedimentary layers settle out over time. And they'll be nice and flat. This is actually an experiment that earth science uses to teach children how sedimentary rock is formed, sedimentary layers. Once the water is removed and everything dries, you have these various layers, and then given enough time and pressure, they will cement together and form sedimentary rock. Now, if you try this in your yard, you're probably not going to see many layers because we have an incredibly thick layer of silt, and you're probably going to shake it up and just see one thick layer of silt in your jar. But imagine if you had hundreds of feet of rock, sand, topsoil, and all of this is churned up and then settles out. You would be able to see all of these different materials and these different layers that would form. Now, This particular thing, you can run down a rabbit hole on this one and spend a lot of time here. There is something called the Great Unconformity. And what we have, remember, these different continental plates were formed by different igneous rock. Igneous rock is magma that cooled into rock. It's not sedimentary, it's magma cooled off into rock. And then we have our sedimentary layers. Old Earth geology says that each one of these layers represents millions of years. So the great unconformity is that we're missing several hundred million to up in some areas up to 1.2 billion years of sediment. So if you look at these layers here we have the igneous rock. Then we have a little bit of sedimentary rock that's actually got some bend to it. And then we have flat layers of sedimentary rock on top of that. So catastrophic plate tectonics, we get a flood, we start getting some layers that settle out. Then we have Pangea slam back together and go back apart, which bends some of that and makes some folds. And then we have flat layers on top as that stuff continues to settle out of the worldwide floodwaters. So this is not something you find only in the Grand Canyon. This is found all over the world. It is found in Europe, South America, Australia. You find this great unconformity. Now, secular scientists will hypothesize that about 650 million years ago, we had something estimating that some of these plates may have been several miles across, and that could also cause gouging and some of the scarring that's seen. So both of these are valid hypotheses. But a worldwide global flood and waters receding off of the earth is also just as valid a hypothesis as snowball Earth. Yes?
Okay, so these same layers are in South America and Australia, I mean, the same?
Yep.
Okay.
So I got this off of a geology Facebook page. The Great Unconformity represents a profound gap in Earth's geological record. This gap, observable at the Grand Canyon and worldwide, marks a boundary where older Precambrian rock meets younger Phanerozoic strata. It's not just a local anomaly, it is a global phenomenon indicating a significant event in Earth's history. So, Old Earth geologists, young Earth creationists, they all agree that there was some sort of catastrophic event. The difference is the timeline and what the actual event was. A lot of the Old Earth geology stuff is based on this is the way it is today, so that's how it must have been 300, 400 million years ago. A lot of the creation stuff is this is the way it is today, but 4,300 years ago, we had a global catastrophic flood that caused all of this stuff. And that's the real difference between that. So, hopefully everybody kind of stayed with me on that, because we're going to stop there, and we're going to talk about genetics next week in the Tower of Babel. So, any questions about, like I say, it's okay for us to consider any scientific theory. Just don't accept it because someone says it. We can fact check it. We can look at it. We can see what the problems associated with it are, and we can come to our own conclusions about stuff. And for us, what's written in the Bible is also going to play a part in what we believe about it. So, any questions at all? Yes.
So last week you mentioned that they had found some fossils of like animals that were fossilized like mid-meal.
Yep.
What's like the old Earth explanation for that?
There's no denial that these animals were just rapidly covered in, they just say it was a localized flood as opposed to a global flood. Because really fossil formation, the only way you're really going to get fossils is you got to have rapid burial quickly. And typically that's going to be through a flood event of some kind. We just, say that there was a worldwide flood, Noah, that's what caused it, whereas the others will say there were a whole bunch of regional floods all over the place and all these animals were independently buried in different events.
I read something in an archaeological site on Facebook, I don't know how valid it is. They found all these bones of whales all together. And it made me stop and think, I hate to even say this because it shows my ignorance, but I never thought about the fish in the ocean all dying.
Yeah.
But I guess it says they did.
At least not all. There would have been at least, the Bible said that all land, air-breathing creation,
Okay.
but there were probably definitely some deaths in the ocean, but there's nothing that said God was going to wipe out the fishes.
So he didn't.
Well, I'm sure that some died, but, I don't think Noah had to have two fish, you're right,
That's what I
and whales and stuff, because they could survive on their own. There were probably large kill-offs due to the catastrophic stuff that was going on.
They found these piles of quail
Yeah.
all together somewhere, the bones or the.
Yeah, oftentimes you'll find groups of similar animals, like they were herd mentality or they were all together when whatever catastrophic event happened.
How about the Lewis Oak crest?
I haven't looked at that.
Thousands upon millions of tons on top of, just thrown up, in Montana, I think it is, just thrown on top.
Yeah,
And now if it were a long time, you'd have brecciation is basically crushed rock. You would have tons of crushed rock. And it's only like a few inches. So how did you get this whole big chunk of millions upon millions of rock over on top of
Yeah.
another rock? They're unrelated. And there's no brecciation. There's no crushing.
Yeah.
It had to be.
one of the things about all of this stuff is when you start looking into it, you can see why some people have entire degrees in that field. Because I at one point had to just quit reading because I could find so much more, and I'm like, I don't have time to talk about all of this. I've just got to quit reading. So I did, and but there, like I say, there's evidence for creation just like there's evidence for the other. In all of these theories, because none of us were there, none of us saw it happen. We don't know how it happened. We just know that it did happen. And I would say those of us in this room believe it happened because God caused it. But what actual mechanism he used, we may find that we are completely wrong and that God just made water suddenly appear and wiped out everything, and then and the continents were the way they were, and he just I think I'll make the Appalachians look like the Caledonia Mountains. We just don't know. So.
So how, I've probably been told this, I don't remember, how, was it sediment that covered the Amarillo Mountains?
That's my understanding, is mainly silt.
Because I know there were fossils
Yeah.
that we found in the hills.
It's supposed to be like one of the biggest mountain ranges in the world right here underneath all the silt and sediment that we're standing on top of.
Doesn't have to be flat, huh?
Doesn't have to. Well, that's all I have, so
Well, what about the rain? We're gonna get,
the rain.
yeah.
Did it rain?
Oh, yeah. That's at the end. After we talk about genetics, it's my very last slide.
So you like being asked about race?
Sheldon's going to explain about the